The 2024 Australian Grand Prix had plenty of memorable moments. One of the most shocking actually came after the race, when Fernando Alonso was assessed a 20-second time penalty for brake testing George Russell and causing him to crash. The FIA clearly felt that Fernando was in the wrong, but was he just trying to preserve position, or was it dangerous driving? It had been a pretty average start for both Fernando Alonso and George Russell heading down under. Both drivers showed that their cars are slower than Ferrari at the moment, so neither look like true podium contenders. Despite that, they were both still hoping for a good result in Melbourne. Despite George finishing third in FP1, he could only manage 7th when it came to qualifying. It was a worse story for Fernando Alonso, as he could only manage 10th on the grid. Yet it was the Aston Martin who was ahead in the final stages of the race, as the pair fought ferociously for 6th place. George had watched his teammate Lewis Hamilton retire from the race with engine issues, and so the expectations of his team were all on Russell's shoulders. He looked to have the pace to not only catch up to Alonso, but to overtake the Spaniard. In the final couple of laps of the race, Russell had closed to within DRS range of Fernando. What the cameras initially caught was George Russell's Mercedes running into the gravel at turn 6, clipping the wall and ending up on its side in the middle of the track. It was a pretty nasty incident that brought out the virtual safety car despite Russell's pleas for a red flag. With debris all over the track, no more real racing was conducted as the crash happened on the penultimate lap of the race. It was a pretty scary incident, but Russell was able to get out of the car unharmed. On replay, it looked like a pretty simple mistake. The back end seemed to slip out on George and he lost control of the car, causing him to run into the gravel. But it was only after the race did we realise that Fernando Alonso had a lot more involvement in the crash than we first thought. You can see in the replay just how close George gets to the rear end of the Aston Martin, so some people thought he may have had some form of brake failure. Well, George made it very clear in his post-race interview what he believed happened. Russell said, "It caught me by surprise. I was half a second behind him and next thing he slams on the brakes, accelerates again, and then slams on the brakes again. I was half a second behind him and the next thing I am on his gearbox. Lost the rear, caught it, and then clipped the wall." George was equally as honest with the stewards after the race. After the race, stewards began investigating the incident and brought in George for his side of the story. The Mercedes driver told the stewards that Alonso had been driving erratically and that the abnormal braking caused him to close the distance unusually fast. This in turn caused George to lose control of the back end of the car due to having less downforce at the apex and causing the crash. The stewards agreed with the Mercedes driver, as they had also felt like Fernando had been driving erratically, and the incident itself was most likely caused by the Aston Martin brake testing Russell. After hours of discussion, the FIA handed Alonso a 20-second time penalty, which demoted him from 6th to 8th. A big part of the decision that led to Fernando's penalty was the telemetry data that was released, showing the pattern of braking from Alonso. The FIA believed that the data clearly showed that Alonso lifted more than 100 meters earlier than he had on any other lap heading into turn 6. Fernando also braked very slightly at a point that he wouldn't normally, with the FIA feeling that the maneuver as a whole was dangerous. But was it really that dangerous? In hindsight, you can see that there has to be some fault targeted in the direction of Fernando Alonso. He was attempting a move to defend his position and took a big risk. But what Fernando was doing could also just be seen as a smart maneuver to try to maintain his position. F1 drivers are taught to make the car as wide as possible when they are defending their position. It's something that an experienced driver like Alonso knows all about. Fans have been crying out for the FIA to allow proper wheel-to-wheel racing, but they know they need to balance that with the importance of keeping Formula One and its drivers safe. This puts the FIA in a tough position, and you can understand why the stewards decided to give Alonso the 20-second time penalty. However, an important question to think about is whether the stewards would have still handed out that penalty if Russell had been able to hold onto the car and not run off into the gravel. If the crash is not quite as violent and race-ending as it is, does Alonso still get that huge penalty? Aston Martin clearly felt the penalty was harsh, especially considering that there was no contact between the two. Team boss Mike Crack said in his statement, "To receive a 20-second time penalty when there was no contact with the following car has been a bitter pill to swallow, but we have to accept the decision." Considering many fans and analysts thought that the penalty was harsh, it's a little bit strange that Aston Martin decided not to appeal the decision. In that same statement, Crack explained that without new evidence the team could not launch an appeal to the FIA to try to undo the penalty. But if Formula One are interested in penalising manoeuvres that cause dangerous accidents, then they haven't been very consistent. Back in 2021, Max Verstappen was hospitalised after his crash at the British Grand Prix. Despite the FIA deciding that it was Lewis Hamilton's fault, they only gave him a 10-second penalty. The sport's governing body is often a little bit more lenient when they can see that an act is in the interest of racing. So I think to give Fernando such a harsh penalty is unfair and doesn't really help keep the sport safe. It looks more like the FIA are reacting to Russell's crash rather than the manoeuvre itself. One of the interesting parts about the statement from the FIA, when they awarded the penalty, was that there was no sufficient information to determine whether or not Alonso's move was intended to cause Russell issues. That's the important thing that is often forgotten. The accident itself was caused by a 1/10 of a second decision that did not have any intent to cause a crash. Alonso was trying to defend his position, and yet the stewards felt as though his change in braking constituted an unusual driving manoeuvre, which was why his penalty was 20 seconds, instead of the standard 10. Fernando himself felt the decision was wrong. He said, "I believe that without gravel on that corner, on any other corner in the world, we will never be even investigated." In F1, with over 20 years of experience, with epic duels like Imola in 2005 and Brazil in 2023, changing racing lines, sacrificing entry speed to have good exits from corners is part of the art of motorsport. Alonso added, "We never drive at 100% every lap, every corner. We save fuel, tyres, brakes. So being responsible for not making every lap the same is a bit surprising." With the difference in Alonso's driving being so small, you have to think that the FIA are more just reacting to the size of the crash than the manoeuvre itself. Not everyone was in support of Fernando in this issue. Former F1 driver Martin Brundle highlighted that Alonso had used the same manoeuvre in the Nürburgring in 2003. Over 20 years ago, it was David Coulthard who was caught out by the move, with Brundle believing that Fernando meant to wrong-foot George. We will never really know whether Alonso wanted to make his rival crash like George went on to do. But was the penalty really deserved? Would the FIA even have launched an investigation if Russell had managed to keep hold of his car? Probably not. So you have to say that Fernando Alonso can look back and think he was unfairly treated by the stewards on this issue. But what do you think? Did Alonso deserve the 20-second time penalty that he was given? Put your thoughts in the comments down below. While you're there, hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.